All right. I think we are live officially. Welcome,
Hey, hello,
everybody.
everyone. Yeah,
Woo!
welcome to our everyday sacred chit chat.
Yeah, it's fun to be here again. I think it's been about a month since our last one, at least, maybe 5 weeks or
Yeah,
something.
yeah,
No,
that
we're
sounds
not
about right.
super keeping track. Um, this week, I'm hoping to get a new episode out on homelessness. I haven't gotten it together yet, but um, no doubt we'll talk about that a little bit. I mean, these live shows for people just kind of jumping in are meant to kind of supplement our recorded materials here and there and give us a chance to talk about current events and our feelings about different things for what that's worth. And we'll be the first to tell you that you shouldn't take anything we say as like important or that it should supersede your own opinions necessarily. We're just here to have basically a friend space and talk about what's going on in the world because I mean there's a lot of relevant things that demand a lot of attention.
Yep, always. Here, I will be right back.
All right, good luck. So I've been reading a lot about you know obviously war in Ukraine. I think that's a huge topic right now on everybody's mind. The war in Ukraine is still going. It's still pretty hot. Um, Vladimir Putin's he got a bite on it and isn't letting go yet. Did you hear about the poisoning recently?
Of like Abramovich or.
Yeah, and a couple of the Ukrainian delegates, I believe, in the peace talks.
Yeah,
Um,
I heard something about that. Abramovich is considered a Putin ally,
yeah,
um, but it's hard to say for sure, uh,
I,
that society there is so corrupt in so many ways that, everybody's. It's like classic court intrigue
mm-hmm,
where like they're all loyal to Putin because he's strong.
yeah,
But if they think that they can take him out and put themselves or another or a better ally in place, like that there's people gunning to do that. I mean, you can look at the history of the Soviet Union and any other monarchy or authoritarian structure. There's always people waiting in the wings. But Putin's been so strong for so long. This has been just really fascinating to follow. It's very sad and tragic, like any war. But I think I, like many other people, expected it would be over in a few days because we are sort of uh, unable to really intervene directly. We can't risk nuclear war. Everyone, most people agree on that. A few
mm-hmm,
wild people don't, but we can't risk a nuclear war with the most armed nuclear country in the world. And so I just was like, oh, that's really sad for Ukraine. Like, they're just going to get steamrolled and basically going to get annexed or maybe cut up. There was
mm-hmm,
talk of Putin might just take the port cities and Kiev and then
yeah,
be like, oh, that's all we wanted. We wanted to liberate those,
yeah.
for the people.
Ukraine would possibly blend into Poland or manage to stay
Right. Who knows
independent.
what would happen to the rest? It would splinter.
Mm-hmm,
But also, from what I understand, Ukraine is a massive, massive grain exporter.
mm-hmm.
So I was just like, well, Ukraine's just going to be part of Russia now.
Yeah,
And
and
but they have just really surprised me, and they've received an incredible amount of training from the U.S. over the last 8 years since Crimea was annexed. They've received a lot of top of the line equipment,
yeah,
better intel, and they're receiving more and more equipment every day. But even despite all of that, like the numbers just don't add up.
yeah. That's been my big problem with it. Is there's sometimes I almost feel like there's a fine line between aiding an ally and just giving people enough weapons to make sure that they take enough of your enemy with them when they die, And I feel like
Mm-hmm.
we've really kind of been playing that line up. And you're at what point would maybe people have given up and the war would be over for better or worse? But you throw enough javelin missiles and AK-47s at a problem, And I'm not saying that we've done the wrong thing here in this particular instance, but if you live in the United States, especially, and most definitely probably if you live in other areas of the world, you realize that we have a deep-seated problem of stirring up revolt against the USSR traditionally, and then funneling massive amounts of weapons and money into whatever group we think can kill as many Russians as possible, as many Soviets, Russians now, of course, and never without really, and the average American has no idea who you are. We may actually demonize you in our media while we're doing it, and a lot of people point fingers at Afghanistan because that ended up very similarly. Not to compare Ukrainian government currently to like stuff that you've seen, with ISIS and Osama bin Laden and all of that. Although,
right, and the Taliban was basically an enemy state in a lot of ways, and they were open about it, but there are still similarities. Also, that Afghanistan was like part of the reason the Soviet Empire collapsed. Many contributing factors, but they wasted so much money and lives and resources trying to subdue Afghanistan. And I remember early on, not really being aware of that, at 19 or 20 when we first went to Afghanistan. But people call it the folly of empires. The British wasted a lot of resources there in the 19th century.
Absolutely.
Because it's not a single nation. But anyway, there is definitely some similarities in terms of the proxy wars that we funded for, 60 years, 50, 60 years, that sort of ended in our childhood. But I still remember fear of the Soviet Union. I remember the Berlin Wall going down.
Yeah, the Iron Curtain. And
I remember when the USSR fell, not really knowing anything about it, but it being the biggest news,
Oh, yeah.
The the USSR had already existed since before our parents were born.
Yeah.
And they lived their entire lives into their 30s and 40s and saw it fall. And so
I tried to.
I was like 10.
Oh, yeah. We're 8, 9, 10. Yeah. I tried to explain it to my partner, and she was, she's about 10 years younger than I am. And so.
She was born right after the fall.
Absolutely. And so I was watching a YouTuber who goes around the Soviet Union and watching some videos. I've got on a Gopnik kick for a while there, and I was like talking about people in the ruins of these giant apartment buildings all over everywhere as far as the old USSR Soviet areas, and I had to explain it to her and just say, like, you don't understand. When I was a kid, it was like there was another evil version of the United States in the world. And it was scary, and it was significant, but it also was interesting because you didn't really know. Like, there wasn't a lot of open media about what was going on inside the Soviet Union between the United States. And so, you would hear about technologies and stuff that are pretty much on par with the stuff you live in. We're old enough that stuff coming from Japan was still seen as cheap, and the bad stuff, you couldn't afford good stuff, when we were little kids, at least. That changed pretty quick, but...
Japan, there were some high-quality things from Japan, but Japan was in the place that, like, Taiwan and mainland China are in now. They added the Sony TVs and a few, prime things. Nintendo was pretty good, I guess, when we were little. But yeah, by and large, like, it was a manufacturing center for the United States until it wasn't.
My favorite line in Back to the Future, because that was like where and that was in our childhood, right? Like, we're probably like 8 years old or something, like, I don't know, maybe 6.
Younger.
They were even younger. And so some of the best stuff was made in Japan at that point, but a lot of the people around us still had a negative opinion of Japan. And there's that part where he goes back in time and he says, he's like, oh, no wonder it broke. It was made in Japan. And he's like, what are you talking about, Doc? All the best stuff is made in Japan. as far as electronics.
Oh yeah.
And so the world was going through all these changes, but yeah, there was this idea that there was a place making stuff on par with our own and like sending people to space and at the
Doing all
time
the same things we were.
exactly, yeah,
But evilly.
I know it's like, and when you're 8, your understanding of the world through GI Joe cartoons is woefully unable to really explain the situation. I wanted to ask you what you think about some of the media coverage that you. Not that I spend a lot of time watching mainstream news on either side of the liberal conservative spectrum.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty artificial divide in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
At
yeah.
least at the top, the billion-dollar media level. I mean, I've read, stories that filter up through Reddit and Google News. I'm in a group chat with some sort of acquaintance friends of mine who are all of them spent time in the military, and neither of us served in the military.
Nope.
You grew up around it. You have probably a little more knowledge.
I was a Navy
but
brat.
neither of us, neither of us ever served. So there's, I rely on the media, and I rely on people I know who were in the military to kind of help me suss out what matters. And so that group chat, like, they all serve. One of them works at the State Department, and they've studied international relations, and they've all got kind of an Army mindset, which has been really helpful because they're chatting and debating. I chime in once in a while with a snarky remark or an article that I found, and they're talking a lot about from a military strategic standpoint. And so I haven't seen a lot of I don't really watch the news anymore at all. I do get some of my news through Google News. Some of it does come from CNN or New York Times, even Fox once in a while. But that's not really where I get most of it. A lot of it, information I'm getting is from The Atlantic and some of those weekly level publications.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm learning a lot about the strategy and the sort of failings of the Russian military strategy.
Yeah.
But I'm not reading a lot or watching news about it because the last few years during Trump and during the impeachments and everything, I just got so burned out by especially cable news coverage, and I don't care what side it is. It's all just trash.
It's a bunch of talking heads trying to tell you what you want to hear.
And like the so-called liberal ones, they're not really analyzing things deeply. They're talking about how bad the conservatives are and how corrupt Trump is, and sure he was. Nobody needs to tell me that. And they're just constantly like scaremongering, fear-mongering, and making everyone think that, if Trump wins the election, the world's going to burn in hellfire. And honestly, I buy into a little bit of that. Like, Trump is an extreme example, but it's just constant, just partisan bickering.
I mean, there was a plague.
There was.
In their defense. Sorry. Less war than I thought there'd be, in all honesty. I thought there'd be more military incursions, especially with Trump at the helm. He turned out to be a little less aggressive than I thought he'd be, mostly towards American citizens and people trying to get in the country and be American citizens. So,
But no, he wasn't a warmonger.
No, he seemed like he would be, so it's kind of surprising.
Yeah, the superiority/inferiority complex often leads to war.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot of thoughts about how the media's covered it. I mean, curious to hear what you think. It does. It's interesting because what I'm seeing is like just watching. I guess my perspective on the media is changing because I heard so much focus on Russia, and now I'm watching as they're a paper tiger in so many ways. It seems like.
Yeah.
And I did not expect that because even like I think Russia did, they spend millions of dollars on disinformation. So much of the toxicity in the media, and mostly in like smaller communities, not. I mean, there's a few media personalities who do seem to
Video Lights,
prefer Russia
70%.
Democrats.
Okay.
But I'm not going to put my tinfoil hat on right now.
Yeah.
Maybe later.
I gotta say, I'm in the same boat as you. I try and watch the odd CNN video here and there to get a feel for what is being said in more mainstream media. Not that I it makes it sound like I do a lot of Alex Jones, but I really don't. I'm not there either. I like people analyzing the information on like former military personnel and things like that, and I do like seeing what like General Petraeus and stuff, like actual experts in their field say without the pundits getting in there and trying to make a story out of it. But there are a lot of things that I question, which is that I really don't know enough about. So I saw bits and pieces of, I think, a speech that Joe Biden gave when he went to Poland. And I think he explicitly said, there was no provocation whatsoever by the United States that led to this. And I can't say that I personally think that that's true. I'm not sure how he's painting that picture.
I think that sounds like just international politics.
Sure.
We're constantly taking little steps.
Well, I mean, this sounds terrible, but honestly, a month before the conflict, I might have agreed with him because I didn't know fully what our country was doing, what NATO was doing, how many military personnel, how many missiles are in Europe at the moment pointed at Russia. I don't know any of these things.
Like 2,000.
Yeah, it's a lot, and they're very close. And I mean, I understand. I'm not saying that, this is all new to me, but I also, and coverage of things like Putin was saying that it's a Nazi government. Certainly doesn't seem to be the case, but
no.
When it came to things like the Azov battalion and stuff operating inside Ukraine, I knew nothing about them, and I've seen nothing about them in any kind of media coverage.
Mm-hmm. It all focuses on Zelensky.
Yeah.
And his heroism.
Yeah, and not...
That was interesting that, you shared a video earlier where the host was analyzing that.
Yeah,
talking about
he
that.
mentioned it.
And I've heard a little bit in some like leftist subreddits that I occasionally will read just to see what they're saying, that there is that element in Ukraine, but they're not like a far right government,
No.
like Hungary right next door.
Yeah, and
pretty far right. Even Poland, pretty far right. Ukraine is fairly centrist for being a former Soviet country. They're probably conservative in the spectrum of Europe.
Sure.
But
it is scary when people are marching under a Nazi banner with American Javelin missiles, though. You're like, ooh, that's not... And they're flying drones and stuff, You're like, oh. And I understand why it's happening. I'm not naive entirely. I mean, if you were Ukraine, you're going to use what you got as far as human resources and train military personnel, despite what banner they're flying, I think. And they're in no way reflecting most of the country or any majority or even most of the minority groups. They're a particular thing. But yeah, like, it's weird I never saw anything about it on CNN.
But granted, I don't watch the in-depth reporting on CNN.
Well,
or
any of that. I'm not in any kind of expert to talk
cover
about
those
it.
things.
Mm-hmm.
There's like the long form televised journalism that I just still don't watch. I just prefer not to watch broadcast, video journalism if possible.
Yeah.
Some YouTube stuff is interesting when it's quick and to the point, but even then, I just going through journalism school and understanding how radio and television news, because of the limited time frame of the medium, excuse me, they have to craft a narrative. They have to point you to certain things and lead you along. That's why, as much as I love documentaries, they're all flawed in some ways. They have to fit into an hour and a half.
Sure.
So they can't help it. Even documentaries I've enjoyed that have been well criticized, like the Michael Moore documentaries. They're great documentaries, and their criticisms are justified, but they're also a full 2-hour movie. But that's the thing. Like, I enjoy it. I often agree with the point he might be making. I might disagree with something another news person's making, but I just don't. The limitations of the media in terms of having the information and allowing you to really disseminate it. I just prefer to read my news.
Oh, absolutely.
Even if it is crap blog news sometimes, at least I can follow a link and look around and chase it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I need to do a lot more of that before I'm able to talk with any kind of real intelligence about what's going on as far as the general political opinions about people in that part of the world. I mean, I can't help but wonder how many people in Russia are ultra conservative and maybe very racially motivated to make sure there's one type of person in their country.
Well, what I'm seeing is so much of the Russian narrative collapsing. Before they actually stepped foot in Ukraine, if they had been making the same argument that the United States is pushing and is trying to expand NATO and is building up all of this, military infrastructure in Eastern Europe, I might have been like, we shouldn't provoke them. And I think in some ways, we were pushing the envelope, but once they attacked and came up with these flimsy stories, and watching how media has collapsed inside of Russia. Before our US companies moved out, they were blocking them, and they were putting they're not even acknowledging what's going on. It just seems like classic military blunder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's there's reports that they've lost over 10% of their fighting force.
Yeah.
Which is, they lost more, in a month in Ukraine than the United States lost in 20 years in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, it's pretty hard to compare. And you look at the size of Russia as a country and the amount of troops it takes to protect what borders they have with potentially hostile neighbors, or places where a force could sail in and attack the country directly. And losing 10% of your forces is a big deal, because it's not like you can strip your other fronts bare to send all your men, and not to mention the logistics involved. Like, how long does it take, you think, to move a tank from the Pacific Ocean, guarding that part of the country, to Ukraine?
Looking at Japan.
Yeah. I mean, it takes months to get it there and in working order.
That also reminds me of the fact that apparently tanks are useless now.
It's looking like that. I mean, this is the first modern warfare we've seen, and
we didn't really use tanks in Iraq or Afghanistan. Maybe I think there were a few in the country, but mostly to defend bases.
A lot of armored personnel carriers, I think, APCs and stuff.
And people I know who've served are like, this is why we don't. Tanks have been a joke for a long time, and that was before drones. But they're just a big target.
Yeah,
and, infantry is key again in a lot of ways, and personnel carriers, nimble vehicles.
Yeah, those are nice, but it's definitely, I heard people in Afghanistan and Iraq, even those the American personnel were putting sandbags on the bottom to stand on, or to put their feet on, because an explosion underneath the thing could kill you. And
Yep.
so, you're literally putting bags of sand on the ground and hoping for the
You're
best.
making your tank immobile. It's basically a turret.
Yeah. Yeah, to protect an APC, and you're like, this isn't even a modern weapon, right? This is just an explosive device buried in the road. And the most expensive military in the world is using sand to try and protect from it. Dirt
Yeah.
in bags.
Yeah.
So,
So we've increasingly, like, our strategy does not really include tanks, and this is, my friends in this chat have shared a lot of analysis breaking some of this down, and I looked into it, and it's, I don't want to think about military stuff much. Never really have. I know a little
yeah.
bit about World War One and World War Two and how they were fought. A little bit about certain battles in the Cold War and the wars in the Middle East. But it's like, I'm not an army guy. I'm not that interested in guns
It's,
and
yeah.
weaponry.
I mean,
like,
it is
the things
reminiscent.
I like about military are like cool jets and helicopters and
Yeah.
some of the Navy ships. With, like,
The Navy
weaponry
ships,
and,
exactly.
yeah.
So, like, in World War One, they built a couple giant navies, the British and the Germans specifically, and I believe, I could be wrong, that they had one encounter because the ships were so expensive to build, and they would lose so much if they lost their ships, which they could lose in one encounter, that nobody wanted to fight, giant battleships against each other. And then by the time you got to World War II, it's famous that the Japanese especially put all this time and effort into building the largest battleships the world has ever seen.
They built an incredible navy.
Oh yeah, the Yamato and whatever her sister ship was. The Shoku, I'm not totally sure. Actually, I think that was a carrier, but it turned out aircraft carriers were the future. And nobody knew that. And
they weren't really there in the beginning of the war.
Yeah, there was like 3 that the U.S. had, and like 4 that, depending on how you're defining carriers. There's light carriers, there's, converts, where they took a regular ship and turned it into a carrier that wouldn't have otherwise been one. But as far as like large aircraft carriers, they were the future. And nobody knew. Because
Right.
they thought that all the guns that you put on the battleship will blow up the planes, and the planes will be mostly useless. And very not true.
Yeah. When planes were slow, sure.
Yeah. But it turns out they're hard to hit. And one
even propeller
pilot
planes.
with one bomb can blow up an entire aircraft carrier. And
An entire battleship.
yeah, they definitely
Destroyer.
a battleship. The Yamato got sank with, I think that took a few, but the lesson still stands. For one of the most expensive pieces of equipment ever known to man, got blown up by some pretty cheap bombs, and that's, I think we're kind of seeing that here. Is like in World War II, the idea of these heavily armored battle tanks became the narrative, and now unfortunately there's very smart missiles, handheld devices, and the drones, whether the Bactar drones or whatever, like, you just can't compete with them. And so I wonder what warfare will look like if there is a World War III. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what the next big thing is.
I feel like remote warfare is a big, instead of tanks, there's going to be land drones.
Yeah, some of those systems where the drone flies above a tank to see which direction fire's coming in, and then firing in that direction. That's kind of future stuff there I didn't see coming. But
Yeah.
I know nothing about military affairs, really. More about history than actual tactics and logistics of battle.
Yeah, and it feels, it's hard to say because we haven't seen 2 equal, highly developed military forces go against each other since World War II.
Mm-hmm. And
where we're digging trenches and we're both facing each other with artillery and tanks and like an equal amount of armament. Like
yeah,
the Ukrainian soldiers are fighting incredibly well beyond anyone's expectations.
without a doubt.
They're still it's a long shot for them for anything, but they're holding out at this
Wow.
moment. As we say this, they're holding out.
And they've already lost
And,
so much.
but they're basic. It's a modern guerrilla warfare. Like they know their numbers, they know the level of their forces, and they're fighting appropriately.
Mhm.
And they're doing it very, they're doing a very good job. But it's not, if we didn't have nuclear weapons and Russia and the United States fought each other, like it would be we would have, we might see trenches coming back, we might see the slow moving of borders where we've just got thousands of soldiers and equipment lined up against each other trying to like make and break and like I don't know how that would be different than the war, except for that we have things like drones, so like even the lines of defense are much more permeable.
Yeah, and it seems incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
I have to say, especially since we like to focus a lot, obviously, on the sacred and spirituality, on those aspects of an event, that it really disturbs me deeply when somebody on a remote controlled drone kills a group of people, without
Yes.
ever having seen them with their own eyes.
Yeah, I guess
And
we haven't really tied this back to everyday sacred yet,
no,
but it
I mean,
definitely
but
does. In that, we're trying to promote. It's right there. It's every day, everything. Life is sacred to some extent, and that doesn't mean you have to be a pacifist vegan, but you have to be aware.
mhm.
We want
These are people.
we want people to just be more connected to themselves, their community, and even people they don't understand, realizing that the people on the other side of a battlefield are still, we don't need war
Yeah.
at this point in our culture.
Well, and the necessities of war devalue human life so quickly. I think so much more than almost any other, and it's debatable, almost any other industry or
Yeah.
proclivity of man. I mean, when it gets into things like labor value and stuff like that, I guess it's, you look at how many slave type people are still in the world. It's pretty bad, but yeah. The necessities of war and the change of technology when it comes to killing other human beings it leads to things that quickly become so difficult to be part of, and like you were saying, like it seems easy to put yourself on like a pacifist level and just say, no, I don't believe anybody should kill anybody, but you don't need to have two people willing to kill each other for people to get killed, unfortunately.
Yes.
And that's been proven too many times, and some of the greatest pacifist nations in human history have been wiped out or are
no
now
longer exist.
Yeah, they're definitely not autonomous. They definitely have no ability to rule themselves. And our country is in no way like better than any other, in my opinion, and when it comes to
we have
practice.
A terrible record.
Yeah, especially devaluing human life through war, and Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, kind of painted that picture our whole lives. And I've seen soldiers say, if you weren't there, you don't have any right to judge. And then the rest of us are like, well, if nobody but you has the right to judge yourselves, what are you doing? Like, then who is judging you? And so it's hard. It really is. And I don't have any answers for it except to be aware of it. It does disturb me that we're funneling so much money and weapons into this, and I think a lot of Americans are really excited about that, but I can't help but feel kind of weird about it at the same time.
I mean, wars has such a strange effect on people, especially in a country that hasn't been directly affected by war on its own soil in like 150 years, not counting the Pearl Harbor attacks. We haven't had war fought on our soil since.
Yeah. Yeah, I think around the early turn of the century, we had some like groups from Mexico coming into Texas towns, and that's almost inconceivable to me today to imagine that. Like any kind of organized military coming in.
The retribution would be,
Yeah.
they're astronomical. But I think like there's a difference between like the oppression and exploitation of labor under capitalism or any oppressive system than the intentional dehumanization and othering that is a necessity of war.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that it happens because of war, because most soldiers, they're kids.
Yeah.
They're 18 to 25 years old. They're haven't even gone to college yet, or they're just out of college. They're still closer to their childhood than they are to like the end of their life. If they make it through the war. And they're not killers naturally, most of them, but they're at an age where they can be manipulated in some ways more easily. They haven't developed that cynicism that is a double-edged sword at a certain age. But if you can convince soldiers that the opposing force is the bad guy, is less than human, is an object of evil, it's much easier to get them to fight. Mm-hmm. And I saw in some ways I've seen that unravel a little bit in the Middle Eastern wars, because there's so much more media coverage in general. Like, we're constantly pushing this idea that Middle Easterners are decent people. You saw in after 9/11, there's a lot of Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, but a lot of pushback even at the time, even if it was the dominant narrative coming from tacitly from the White House and from mainstream America, that this is an enemy group and they hate our freedom.
Yeah.
Even at the time, there were people who were like, the Iraqis are still people, and they're also like the descendants of one of the most ancient civilized cultures in human history, and then there was a counter narrative. It was weak and it was suppressed in America, but it was there, and I'm sure that was around before, but I feel like that is an area that's grown. Like, we're spending a lot of time being more inclusive in general in culture. We're writing DEI manifestos and trying to build this into how we run society. So when we fight, it's a lot harder to make these racist stereotypes that we've used to justify war since time immemorial, either racist or the British and the French hating each other. Mm-hmm. and belittling each other, and it's just difficult. It still happens. It's necessary for it to really be successful. But if the narrative of they're actually evil falls apart, and as we've talked about in this podcast, the concepts of good and evil are problematic in some ways.
Yeah, and they're so two-dimensional that they don't really reflect the world we live in.
But did you ever see Black Mirror?
Some episodes.
There was one episode that this reminds me of, where it was a soldier, not too distant future. He's got some high-tech stuff, but he's fighting urban warfare, and it seems like it's this invasion, like an alien invasion. Mm-hmm. And he's fighting these kind of orcish monsters, and they speak this terrible language, and they look bloodthirsty and monstrous, and he goes through and he's fighting, and but his equipment is starting to glitch, and he's starting to get these weird visions and these like whispers and things. And just to cut to the end, I don't remember the whole episode, but in the end, like his HUD, his heads up display, glitches out completely, and he sees that the people he's fighting are just other human beings.
Yeah.
And so he's in this full immersion sort of AR system that is like translating the speech in weird ways and like distorting their faces and making them monstrous. And the same thing is happening to the enemy soldiers. It's kind of like there's this moment where they realize that they're not fighting monsters, that they're just fighting people that look just like them.
Yeah.
And it's like, I feel like something like that, or some new way of crafting this is increasingly necessary in Ukraine. In that situation, like the propaganda from the Russians is we're liberating this space, we're cleansing this country, and for the Ukrainians, they're defending their homeland. And defending your homeland is always a worthy cause.
Absolutely, hard to argue with defense of the homeland. I'm ready to move on, I think, because we've only got like 20 minutes left, roughly. But
I mean, it's
it'll come up again.
It's a big thing, and
it's not over.
This feels like a bigger event than 9/11 did.
Well, yeah.
And there's been plenty of war over the years since 9/11. We've been involved in a lot of it. And I don't think it's racist to say this is different. I do agree with, the criticism that this is getting more coverage than a lot of things going on in, I don't know, more browner skinned areas.
Oh yeah, I mean,
which is true. Those conflicts deserve coverage.
Well, and there's
what's different is the repercussions. Like, they don't have nuclear warheads pointed at each other, and they don't have the two great military superpowers at odds over it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fully aware that I point out how it's frustrating that we pour all this money into killing Russians when our government's been pouring money into the Israeli military to kill Palestinians for my life.
Longer, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
And also when they're, cutting universal like child lunch programs, and we're still not able to afford health care, and we're still, there's all of militarism to me seems like a folly.
Yeah.
Like, if everyone has everything they need and you want to start, want to play armies, go ahead.
Yeah.
But even then, like, why don't we go further out into space? I don't know.
It's hard. I mean, because we have the bomb, and that's
where would we see society heading if we're going to segue for the last?
Yeah. No, it's. I did want to talk about a couple things. I got a little list.
Oh, good.
A show on homelessness is coming out. And I wanted to throw some caveats in that we didn't really get to in the show. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the term of... Just come clean about the use of the term homeless over some other terms that are becoming preferential in a lot of different groups and communities. Like unhoused, I think is a common one. I know there's more out there.
There's also people experiencing homelessness, emphasizing the people over the situation.
Yeah. And I just want to say personally, for me, if you're wondering why I didn't use those terms, there's a thing called the euphemism treadmill that's become popular in the last 20 years or so.
We can link to this as well.
Yeah, I'd like to find a good thing that talks about the people, like Steven Pinker is the person responsible for kind of coining the term. But I'm just trying this out. I'm not saying that in the future I may not use other terms to describe homelessness, but I just want to come clean about why I'm still using it, and that's because I do believe that in the English speaking world, especially because that's what I know, we have a bad habit of taking these things that become derogatory terms because of how we
usage.
Yeah, because of how we see it. You know, there was a point where like the R word um, was used because it was a scientific term for somebody, and it was better than like imbecile or you know.
Said the R word. That's really
Sure. Yeah. No. It's thrown out there, and I can use it. I mean, it's still used. I'm in a lot of biological anthropology courses in the last couple of years, and they will say, like the cell growth was retarded, or there's a retardation of the proper development in place, and but I definitely there was a point where I just had to stop using that to insult something.
Yeah.
Because
we're definitely guilty of that in our younger years.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and gay too.
Yeah,
like gay.
Something being
sort
gay
of went on a different trajectory.
Yeah,
in that it's no longer used to describe people being gay. It's that.
Yeah, what we tried, and that's a perfect example of what I'm hoping we can do, is that the problem is we are still associating people that don't develop mentally this in the quote unquote average way as a general insult for other human beings, and that's why any term we use to replace the R word for is going to quickly become just the same thing. And what I feel we tried to do with gay especially was just strip out the negative connotations and say flat out, look, yeah,
it's okay to be gay.
Yeah, I'm gay. So what? And there's a lot of terms that we also used to describe people who were homosexual that nobody says anymore, and I think that's good because they were only used, I'm pretty sure, as insults. But definitely, the problem is that all these words just keep the euphemism treadmill. You can kind of see the picture in your head where. It's like
I think the mental handicap is really the strongest example to illustrate that, because you can look back over the last 200 or 300 years. I don't know the order of it, but basically words like imbecile were a clinical term to replace idiot, and then like it's probably scoring. And then like moron was also like a clinical term at one point.
Yeah.
And then eventually it became like, mental retardation. And but as like the insult usage eclipsed the sort of medicinal clinical usage, and also with people experiencing some mental handicap, like society treats them very poorly and has historically treated them even worse than they do now.
Yeah.
So, there weren't people out there trying to defend the mentally challenged or whatever term you want to use, because they weren't defending themselves. They were often locked away if they had a severe enough problem. If they were just maybe a little slow, they would get a diagnosis, and they'd carry with it, and then anyone else could use that, could lobby that as a general insult. And so you can watch that, and like the one we saw in our lifetime was the R word, which is it's a shame, because like you said, it's a good word. Like it's a fairly accurate one, because it's like a word. I'd love to look up the specific etymology, but it's a word that means like something is prevented. So you
Yeah.
have fire retardant that slows the fire down.
And so
You know,
when
it's
you
like
talk
a
about
shield.
being developmentally disabled, it means the same thing. And that's the
Mhm.
problem is instead of changing how we perceive the term, we're just replace the term with something that is the same exact thing and will undoubtedly be
Right.
used to insult people going
And
forward.
with homelessness, unhoused, I've heard a lot of times, and I've never heard anyone I know living on the street who's used any of those terms or has cared at all. It's all
Yeah.
like academic discussion, and that's like the word unhoused and homeless are nearly identical. And the argument I've heard is that when you don't have a place to live, home is different than a house. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
you can have a home without being in a house, but if you're living on in a tent, you're making a space for it. It's I don't know. It seems almost paternalistic to be like, oh, they've put a home together for themselves in their shelter, which I believe is true. I'm not, people are very good at making space for themselves, very ingenious species. But it sort of like feels to me at least like it takes away from the real material change. Like there was the difference between calling someone homeless and unhoused makes no material change in their life.
No.
It might make someone feel better who's an advocate or who's outspoken, who's bothered by the housing crisis, but it's not building more housing. It's not looking at any of the fundamental issues. It's not tackling
Sure.
addiction or hunger, and so that's for me. That's part of the reason I've stuck with it. No one has made a convincing enough argument to me that changing my verbiage is going to have any impact on the situation.
Absolutely. And I
And
think
I deal with people on the street all the time, like
Yeah.
on a daily basis in my market, and it's usually fine. A few times it's been rather traumatic for myself and some of my coworkers, and often for the people involved that are there on the street, on the other side of it, and they're often sleeping under the eaves of a building where I'm about to set up a farmer's market.
hmm
I don't want to be like, oh, they've made a home for themselves, even if it's a little corner that they make for an hour and then pick it up and move it, because I want their life to be better.
Yeah. I mean, I specifically. Yeah. Okay, so my goals for the way that we refer to homeless people can be summed up pretty easily in that first off, I want a lot of those negative connotations that come with this idea of homelessness to be equated with the fact that they're just normal people without homes. Like
Mm-hmm.
we don't need to put all that baggage on and say again it's their fault because and another problem, the other side of that I'm talking about is that our terms are inadequate to explain that homeless people are in a lot of ways a victim of our capitalist society that has really just kind of they're just the bottom common denominator. And I think in the West at least we've crafted a lifestyle that many of us barely stay afloat, and the people that can't keep up end up on the bottom. And as long as not too many people are below that line, the government doesn't do anything about it. Because our
Mm-hmm.
government hasn't set the bar to the point where it's like, no, everybody should have a home, and that's why
Right.
it exists. It's not their
We
fault.
touched on that a lot in the episode, I believe, but
Absolutely.
that history of blaming the people living on the street for homelessness goes back a long time, and it's not a tragedy. It's I find it offensive. I think that's exactly what I said in the episode, and because not everybody necessarily needs a house and a piece of land to live on, but everyone should have like a secure, reliable shelter when they need it.
Absolutely.
We're never gonna get to the root causes of addiction and other forms of poverty, and the results of coming out of of an abusive household or a neglectful household, or just being down on your luck, losing your job in a recession. You know, there are people on the street now who are addicted to drugs, who have possibly violent problems and other issues, that became homeless, because of the recession, and they didn't have those problems when they ended up on the street. And sure, they made bad decisions. They could have decided the whole time not to drink and not to smoke and not to try harder things, but honestly, like, if I was in the same position, I might. That's the thing. Like,
Well, and I don't know.
I lost my job. I lost my house. I might as well get fucked up a couple times, and
Sure.
then it can spiral. Addiction spirals, and many people who are addicted are very ashamed of it and wish that they weren't, and wish that they could get out of it.
Hmm.
And there's this narrative that they're bad people that just
Yeah.
I can't get over it.
And calling them unhoused does nothing to address that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really, in fact, it just makes it seem like they're just waiting for a new house. When that doesn't paint the inequality in our country in a way to give the ability to say this is a systemic issue that needs to be fixed. And so if there's a good term that replaces that and incorporates that, I'd like to see it too, because I think it's. But will you see people on the news using that? I don't know, right?
Yeah. I guess on the other hand, I guess I'm glad we're not calling people on the streets hobos and bums.
That's I agreed, certainly, and that's it's
So
not.
homelessness, calling them homeless was an evolution from that.
Mm-hmm. I agree, definitely. So I think we got a little more time here. This is totally out of left field, but in some ways related. I wanted to talk about the usage of land acknowledgements.
Oh, interesting.
Because they're becoming prevalent. And,
almost standard.
Yeah. No, I'm seeing it on people's emails when they put their signature at the bottom. It includes a land acknowledgement. I'm seeing it. I'm Wiccan, and I do public rituals as ministry, and definitely see it a lot coming into our rituals to begin. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit.
And like preamble to business plans.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, no, that's a good topic.
So
I've thought about it a little. I don't really know how I feel.
Yeah.
I'm not like, oh, we should all do land acknowledgements. It's the best thing ever. But I also I do appreciate that people are acknowledging that
it's coming up. Absolutely.
Like, it seems like such a new thing in the last 5 years. I feel like I saw a few earlier than that, but now, yeah, I've seen people on Instagram. They just have like, every time they post, they're like da 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 da, and then there's like a little hash that's like blah 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 unceded land. And it's just like a geotag almost.
Absolutely. And it's very common in spiritual groups and spiritual circles and spiritual communities. You'll see it, I think, more than anywhere else. I do some interfaith work for some eco group that's part of predominantly Christian churches, and they begin every session with a land acknowledgement. So mm-hmm. I'm going to posit some hypotheticals here. And I mean, actually, we're kind of running short on time, even though we'll probably go 10 minutes over. I don't want to make this a half an hour thing, and it really could be. So maybe we'll visit.
We can explore this a little bit more, or just I don't know, just some indigenous related topic where this would be part of it.
Absolutely.
It's a big part of spirituality and America and in the Northwest in particular,
Yeah.
with
So
pluses and minuses.
I did want to bring up that the American Anthropological Association put a temporary hold on their own, and because it came to their attention, and I totally understand why this is happening, that some land acknowledgements probably do more harm than good in the eyes of actual indigenous peoples of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people don't know about this. I mean, we kind of touched about it on our last live stream when we were talking about how people will use a certain kind of language to describe certain groups to really kind of put a connotation, to put some subconscious seeds planted in your head that when I mentioned and went off, let's be honest, about the article describing people that speak French and listen to French music as listening to songs in their local tongue.
Right.
Where you're using language, what you're saying is technically true, but the way you're saying it paints a picture, and that picture changes how the concept sits in people's heads. Now, one of the big things that came up, and this I absolutely personally connect with, which is the use of, in land acknowledgements, they'll often say things like, this is the ancestral lands of this group, rather than just saying it's their land. This is their homeland. Nobody in Ireland is like, these are the ancestral lands of the Irish. They're like,
this is Ireland.
Yeah, this is our land.
The land of the Irish.
Exactly. I was in Ireland for a few weeks. Granted, I didn't live there very long. I never once heard anyone refer to it as their ancestral lands. Right? And the reason for that is because they don't think of it as their ancestral lands. They think of it as their lands first and ancestral after the fact. Although the Irish are probably people that came in.
Now.
Absolutely. But what indigenous people want in something like a land acknowledgement is generally a statement that this is their land and should be given, and control of the land should in some way be given back to the natives of that land. They're unfortunately, a lot of indigenous people, and this happens to Guamanians, and that's why, personally I get it, as there's always people trying to write a narrative of, in the past, these people took care of this land. In the past, this was their land, and now many people live here, as if to say, and then to get around the fact that white people came and colonized it and took it over. And so if you're writing a land acknowledgement, I would definitely say, don't call it the ancestral land of this tribe, such and such tribe, and leave it at that. Explain, maybe you'll say it's their ancestral land, but explain that it is still their homeland, and they are not gone. This is still theirs, and in a lot of cases, they would like it back, or at least some measure of control over what happens to it. And so, definitely, we are...
I see a lot that say the unceded tribal lands.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is a little bit closer. I'm trying to... There's... Have you heard of the Real Rent movement?
The Real Rent?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
So Real Rent is a concept... Let me get to this. Calls on people... I don't know if this exists outside of Seattle. There's an organization called Real Rent Duwamish. And I believe this is a broader movement as well, but I know it's here in Seattle. So it calls on people who live and work in Seattle to make rent payments to the Duwamish tribe. Though the city is named the Duwamish leader, Chief Seattle Thrives, the tribe has yet to be justly compensated for their land, resources, and livelihood. It's also not a federally recognized tribe. So Real Rent is this nonprofit that has a lot of people have signed up, making like a monthly donation
Mm-hmm.
to this, and it goes. Hopefully, it all goes straight to the tribe. That's my understanding. They're a well recognized organization. There's city councilors and,
Yeah.
and a few other people, and they, maybe it's not them because I'm not seeing it here, but the Duwamish tribe, I believe, has a land acknowledgement
Mm-hmm.
on their website that they encourage Seattle groups to use
Yeah,
or to modify slightly
that's a good way to
as a
go about it.
basis. And I think that's what a lot of people down here in the city are doing,
Mm-hmm.
because there is that criticism with a lot of it's a fair criticism in a lot of areas of that paternalism.
Yeah.
And we're talking about this a lot in the farmers market organization because we want to bring in more diverse set of farmers, including BIPOC farms, specifically Black-owned farms. We actually have a fairly diverse set of farm owners, like some Hmong farmers that have emigrated here in the last 30 years, a lot of Hispanic farmers, some Asian farms, but there's I struggle to name a single like Black-owned farm that's selling in our farmers markets. There's a few that we're in touch with. There's a few Black-owned businesses, um, people making other foods, and so we're trying. On the one hand, we're trying to bring in a more diverse set of vendors into the system. COVID actually shook things up enough that is more of a possibility than it used to be, where we lost some vendors. There's gaps. I run the U District market, which is the second biggest market in Seattle, which makes it one of the larger markets anywhere in some ways. And I've got gaps, and historically there was a long wait list, and a lot of vendors were just like, no, you're just not the right fit because you're some particular food processor that we already have, or it just doesn't make sense. It's too much of a niche. But now, we're actively recruiting. I actually might bring in, there's a group called the Black Farmers Collective that farms over in Woodinville, as well as downtown Seattle, through a Small Axe is the name of the farm. I'm hoping to bring them in this season. And it's that's nice. And I feel good about that. But there's this element of, we're like, we want more Black farmers. And so we're going to go out and get Black farmers, bring them into our markets. And I'm like I said, I feel good about it, but I also feel a little weird because I don't know any of them. I'm not talking to them. I'm not hearing what they want too much, except, as a farmer's market, my main job is to provide them a business opportunity. And I hope to develop a relationship and like understand a little bit about things that are going on beyond that. But it's still a little be like, oh, I need a Black farmer. I'm going to find a Black farmer and bring him into my market. It's complicated.
No, yeah, no, and I don't think you have to think long about it to see why it feels a little strange.
Yeah. But the other side, in the same vein, as trying to bring a more diverse set of vendors into the markets, we're trying to research into how we as an organization, through potentially future markets or other partnerships, can better serve certain areas of Seattle that are, not currently served by a farmer's market, have a limited access to fresh local food, including like South Seattle, sort of the Rainier Valley, and maybe like the Pioneer Square downtown, International District areas that I kind of fantasize about. But there's the risk of going into like Rainier Valley, which is a very diverse part of the city, one of the most diverse areas in the region, or in areas of parts of the country. There's people from like dozens of countries and regions all living together in a small area. And we, as like a fairly large market organization, don't want to just go in and like set up a farmer's market. 10 years ago, that might have been what we did. But now, we see the need there. And, if this idea has been stalled, I hope we can make some progress on it maybe next year. But finding some urban farmers or food banks or even cultural groups in that area, and perhaps finding a way to support them in building a market. If they want us to take it on more, work with them there. And I feel better about this idea. It's not anything that we're doing, but we're trying to avoid just going in and being like, there's not enough fresh local food in the Rainier Valley. We're going to make a Rainier farmers market. and just, working with the city, getting the permits and going in, because we really probably could if we could find a space. But then we would be bringing the same farmers and the same vendors that are in, the Magnolia Market and the U District Farmers Market down to the Rainier Valley. No one who lives there who's making food is going to be represented. And farmers with a similar background to them, from these diverse areas are going to be represented. So I hope that when this happens, we make that step, and really work with the community to find out, the types of food they want. And if there isn't a farmer who's already growing it, maybe encouraging existing farmers to grow, certain veggies that might do well with that community, because in the long run, we want to see members of that community farming in Washington. In the short run, we would at least like to provide some of that fresh food that people are actually looking for the cuisines that they're used to. Because food access and especially food, like emergency food access in the United States, has a history of being incredibly paternalistic, and it's gradually gotten better. But in the past, like if you were on food stamps or before food stamps, you got like a box of food aid where you had no control over it.
Yeah.
And it's gradually moved to food stamps, and we have some of these systems in place now. And we want people to be able to get the foods that match their culture. And that's both those who are getting assistance and then just those living in the community who can afford to shop at the market.
Excellent.
They're trying to avoid that paternalism.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it does mean a lot to people. You sometimes it's hard until you miss that, and I think a lot of Americans, if they probably travel to other parts of the world, can start to see that. Although McDonald's is everywhere, and
hey, I really miss peanut butter when I travel.
Yeah, Nutella's great. I get it, but
yeah,
it's not peanut butter.
Which is such a funny thing, because it's like peanut butter. It's whatever, but we really love it in the United States.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. I
assumed it was everywhere because, I didn't have much of a expanded worldview outside my own culture, but, Well, I think we should wrap it up. Looks like we're about an hour and 12 minutes in, so...
Great.
I think our work here is done for now, but we'll be coming back next month with another show.
And we've got a couple recordings. We just need to get them edited and get them put up.
Season 2 is on its way.
Yes.
We're excited. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. And this is now recorded for posterity, so it can be enjoyed at any time. But thank you very much. And
thank you.
Take care. Blessed be. I just need to remember how to stop it.